Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to start looking ahead to draft season for 23-24, and specifically we're looking at the top 5 overdraft risks for the upcoming draft. Now we're talking forwards and defensemen. I'll do a separate video on goaltenders. And a quick disclaimer, for this analysis and most of them on the channel, I'm using the player ratings from the Data Draft Player Hub, which is a measure of how complete a player is in covering goals, assists, power play points, shots, hits, and blocks. So if you want access to the Player Hub, there's a link in the description where you can find it. But what does it mean to be an overdraft candidate or an overdraft risk? So this was an analysis project I did. This is not my opinion necessarily. And this, for the purpose of this exercise, these are the criteria I used to define players who are overdraft risks. So we're looking for guys who have a significant jump from their 5-year average to last season. So if they were a 5-year average of around a 55 or something, and then all of a sudden last year they were an 80, that's something that's going to raise some red flags, and you're going to want to do a little bit more homework and digging to see if that's a one-off season or if that could be repeated. Minimum 4 seasons, that's kind of like a loose rule. We're just trying to filter out younger players who are still establishing themselves in the league. They're improving year to year, and maybe their 3-year average or 2-year average is going to be different because there's not a lot of data to back that up. So we filtered out a lot of those younger players that are still improving, guys like Tage Thompson and such, who are still improving and put up a really good season that deviated from their average. We're also looking for some of the top players, top 20% of players last year, because obviously you're not going to overdraft a player who's below that. So we're looking for the top tier players, the guys who are fantasy relevant, so to speak. And we also don't want to see a steady upward trend. That would be a good sign if you're trying to draft a player, because it shows that he's improving in the right direction. But for this, we're looking at overdraft risk. So guys who are, kind of in the same channel, they're always between 55 and 60 or something, and then they pop off for that 1 year last year, which could be a significant risk if you try to draft them too early. Now again, all of this depends on where these guys are going to be drafted, and we don't know that yet because mock drafts are very empty right now. I haven't even started looking at them. They're probably not even available in a lot of places. So it is dependent on where these guys are going to get drafted, but we'll start at number 5 and go down to number 1. And at number 5, we have Sam Bennett. Now, his 5-year average is around a 65. Last year, he was around a 78. It's a 19.86, almost a 20% deviation between his average and what he put up last year. In addition to that, career high in assists with 24, career high in hits with 150, 193 shots as well. He was a shots and hits monster for the Florida Panthers, and those are peripherals that he could probably repeat. So he's not necessarily going to regress all that much. And if you look at this, there is a clear trend here when he moved to the Panthers. So 71, 75 essentially, and a 78. So he is steadily improving, which is why he's not that much of a risk. But what we are seeing is almost 20% deviation from his 5-year average, which is brought down by this season in 1920 when he was still playing for Calgary and not getting a ton of ice time. So he'll probably hit and shoot again this year, and he may get more ice time with injuries to key guys in Florida and with Duclair moving on, etc. But let's not forget, Bennett was also injured during the playoffs with an undisclosed injury, and I don't have a timeline for him. I assume he's going to be ready for camp. But the deviation on the 5-year rating trend graph doesn't look like that much. His median is 71.25 right here when he first came over. So he's not that far from that, but his 5-year average is 65, so he is a little bit higher than that in terms of what he did last year, so about 13 points higher to be exact. Now, given that I believe the Stanley Cup hangover affects the losing team more than the winning team, and given all the injuries to the Panthers, they have obviously Tkachuk and Ekblad, Montour. A lot of guys were hurt in the playoffs and aren't going to be ready to go to start the season. I do think there is a significant chance that a lot of guys on Florida regress. Bobrovsky being one of them. Obviously, the defenseman that we just mentioned, Bennett, would be one of those guys who faced some injuries as well. I do think a lot of those guys are going to regress a little bit. Depends on how much, but even a little bit of regression would put him back into the 70s range. And if you're drafting him to be the 12th best left winger in fantasy or the 57th best player, if you're going to draft him around that 57 range, I do think that's a little bit high for this type of player. I think I would target him more in the 8th round and beyond, maybe the 9th round and beyond, just given the fact that he's a peripheral stat stuffer and not necessarily an elite producer. Only 0.63 points per game last year. So, not one of the upper echelon point scorers. He was 81st percentile there, not bad. 82nd in goals, 78th in assists, but still. Not necessarily a guy that I'm going to want to draft too early. So a good player, but don't jump to grab him too early. Now at number 4, we have Jake DeBrusk. And last year he went off, tied a career high in goals with 27, career high in points with 50, career high plus minus, career high shots, power play points, and ice time, averaging just under 17 minutes a game. Now his ice time may actually increase this year because the Bruins lost 4 of their top 7 forwards, obviously Hall, Foligno, Bertuzzi, Bergeron, and Krejci as of now, all not playing. And that's a huge problem. So he might get more ice time, but he's got a lot less to work with, and he doesn't have a number 1 center on either of those lines. If he's on the top line with Pastrnak or if he's going to be playing second line, he still doesn't have a really good play-driving center like he would have had last year. Last year, he was the 17th best left winger in fantasy in terms of completeness on this player ranking scale, 94th player overall. So he was pretty productive, and he was drafted at ADP 164. So he was pretty good value if you got him there last year. But here's what we're talking about. He's stuck in this channel for almost all 4 years before this past season, in that, upper 50s, lower 60s range, and then he just pops off for this one season. That's the danger in terms of drafting Jake DeBrusk. He's almost 25% higher than his 5-year average. So that is what we're looking for in this analysis project, is guys that are in this kind of a channel, maybe even trending downward like DeBrusk was. He did pop up a little bit here, and it was the first year under Jim Montgomery, so that could explain this jump, but I don't see any. I mean, last year everything went right for the Bruins, and I just don't see that happening this year. So he is due for a regression, and even if he regresses 5 points, that puts him at a high 60s player, which I would, usually high 60s, low 70s players, you can usually find those on the waiver wire. You don't even have to draft them. So that's why I'm listing him as an overdraft candidate. If you're going to grab him this year, I would do so after the 100th pick. I don't see him being in the top 100 this year. So, if you got him at ADP 164 this year, that would be another good spot to draft him, but don't try to jump up and pick him based on his stats last year. And obviously you see a lot of that in the draft room. People that don't follow this that closely, they'll just look at the stats from last year. That's what we're trying to avoid with this analysis project. Now, up at number 3 is a guy that I owned last year and really liked having on my team, Vince Dunn. Career high in goals, assists, points, plus minus, power play points, power play assists, and time on ice, almost 24 minutes a game. His previous career high in points was 35, so he basically doubled up that last year. 26 years old, he'll probably play well again this season, but last year the Kraken were the second best team in terms of shooting percentage, 11.6 shooting percentage. Edmonton was number 1. And you'll remember back to 21-22, St. Louis was one of the top 3 best scoring teams in the league, but they had a significantly higher shooting average. And that obviously regressed back down last year, and they were nowhere near as good last year. And I could see the same type of thing happening to Seattle. Now, they are a good defensive team, and they could potentially still be a good team this year, but there is that room for regression just built into that shooting percentage. On top of that, he's probably keeping that power play 1 spot unless they go out and get Erik Karlsson or something like that. But the power play last year was 21st in the league at 19.8%, and that was with that shooting percentage. So if that percentage comes down, even if it doesn't, they're still not a prolific power play. They did lose a guy like Daniel Sprong, who was per 60, one of the top 5 goal scorers in the league, and he is a power play specialist as well. So the power play might even come down a little bit from where it was last year. We never know with these types of things, but just looking at all the data right now, that's what it's pointing to. Now, his hits and blocks were really good, 66th percentile, 70th here. Pretty good for an offensive type defenseman who was 96th percentile in assists. And he may be able to back that up. But even if he comes down 10 or 15% in his assist production, he's probably not going to be the 16th best or most complete defenseman in fantasy next year. Probably not going to be the 61st ranked skater in general. So that's what we're looking at here. And again, you're looking at this channel, 62, 55, 66, 66, and then jumps up 10 points around 19.15% to a 76, basically a 77 last year. Really complete player, really good season for Vince Dunn. I just don't want to rush to grab him this year. I wouldn't look at him earlier than the 6th round. Probably between the 7th and 10th round is when I would start looking at Vince Dunn for the reasons that I just gave you. Now at number 2, we have two players, 2A and 2B, because they're very similar in terms of why they're here. Arturi Lehkonen had an incredible season last year. I owned him as well. I had both Dunn and Lehkonen. And Lehkonen was a beneficiary of being in the top 6 in Colorado and on Power Play 1. And there's reason to believe that he'll be back in both of those positions this year. He was the 8th ranked left winger in terms of my rankings of completeness last year. And if you draft him as the 8th best left winger in the league this year, I just don't see how he holds that value. What you're looking at here, career high in points, 51, career high in goals, career high in power play points as well. And a lot of those are not necessarily repeatable in terms of, if it's a career high, you're asking him to put up another career high season. That's a lot to ask for a player who's been typically a middle 6 forward for most of his career. But his shooting percentage has been pretty consistent between 11.8 and 14% over the last 4 years. So he may be able to keep scoring goals at about a 20 goal per game or 20 goal per season pace. I do think of him as a solid fantasy option this year because of the fact that he's still in the top 6 and could see some power play time in Colorado, and they will probably be healthier. But the main reason he's number 2 on this list is the deviation from his average is over 50%. So you're looking at his average 53.19 last year and 80.48. Look at how complete he was. 89th percentile in point production, 88th in goals, 86th in assists, 84th in shots, 93rd in power play production, 68th in hits, 56th in blocks. So he did a little bit of everything, stayed relatively healthy over the last 5 years, 93.17% of his games he was healthy for, or in the lineup for, I should say. And you do see this trend here from when he comes to Colorado. He was in Montreal, he was a 45, comes to Colorado, bumps up to a 64, and then bumps up even more. But you're still seeing a massive gap between the median or the 5-year average and what he did last year. And that means that he's ripe for regression. And even if he comes down 10 points, he's not going to be the 8th ranked left winger. He's not going to be in the top 40. And if you're drafting him to be that, then you're making a mistake thinking that he's going to be able to reproduce that. Now, along those same lines, Val Nichushkin is another one of those types of players. Overall, I do like Nichushkin for the same reasons I like Lehkonen. He's in the top 6. He'll play with McKinnon or Rantanen. He usually gets power play one time. Last year, he had 16 power play points in only 53 games. So that was 93rd percentile in the league for power play points per game, which is really incredible. And he could potentially keep that up. And of the two of them, I would imagine they'll keep Nichushkin on PP1 over Lehkonen. But like Lehkonen, his deviation from his 5-year average is 47%, which is the second most behind Lehkonen of any player in this data set. And you can see there's a massive gap here between his median and his 22-23 ranking. So whether you're using the average or this number right here, because the reason why his average is so low is this season in 18-19. If you'll remember back, that season he was playing in Dallas, and he scored 0 goals in 57 games, only 10 points, and he was a -4. So that's obviously going to bring down his ranking, but it is worth noting that he went 57 games without scoring a goal, and he's now supposed to be a goal scorer who was 88th percentile in goal per game production last year. So if you take that season out of his average, his 4-year rating average is a 67.63, and he's still 23.6% above his 4-year average. So either way you slice it, he's due for a regression. And more importantly, he was the 6th ranked left winger on the hub last year. I don't necessarily see that being repeatable. I believe that will be too risky if you're trying to grab him within the first 4 or 5 rounds. If you can find him after the 5th, 6th, 7th round in that range, then there is value to this player because there is a clear uptrend. He did kind of go sideways here. He went from 29 to 55. That's a pretty good jump. Sideways a little bit, but another massive jump from 56 to 78, and then a small jump between 21-22 and 22-23. Obviously, both of those were with Colorado. So the fact that he's still in Colorado's top 6 power play 1 means that he is probably going to be a good fantasy player next year, but there's just so much room for regression in this file that I have to put him and Lehkonen both at number 2 on this list. But that brings us to number 1, and number 1 is going to be Brandon Montour. And there's a number of reasons why. So first and foremost, you're looking at a 35.25% deviation from his 5-year average. He's been the prototypical guy for this analysis, typically around this 60 range, 55, 60, 63, and then jumps up 20 points to almost an 84. If you round up, it is an 84, which is why he's an 84 over here. He had career highs in goals, assists, power play points, ice time, 24 minutes of ice time last year, shots. He finished 12th in Norris voting. He was in the Stanley Cup Finals, which is going to increase his name value, getting a lot of media attention in that regard. But his previous career high in points was 37, so he basically doubled that last year. His previous career high in assists was 27. He had 57 last year, so 30 more assists than his previous career high. On top of that, Montour had shoulder surgery after the playoffs. He's expected to miss the first month of the season. Now, that's not necessarily a death blow, because you can notice Charlie McAvoy last year was out for the first month of the season, came back and played really well. The difference is I drafted McAvoy. I got him in the 9th round. If you're going to get Brandon Montour in the 9th round, that's great value. If you're going to get him in the 3rd or 4th round, you're going to make a mistake here, because there is such a massive gap here between his rating last year and his average. He did get injured in the playoffs, and it's not just him. He has several teammates who were injured as well. Ekblad with shoulder surgery, a broken foot, a torn oblique muscle. Lusterinen had a fractured leg. Bennett had an undisclosed injury. Tkachuk, broken sternum. We all know that. In addition to that, the following players are also gone. Radko Gudas, Anthony Duclair, Patrick Hornquist retired. Both Stalls are out. So definitely not the same team as last year. And then on top of that, OEL was brought in. So now technically, when everyone's healthy, there are 3 guys that they could use to quarterback power play 1, which may eat into Montour's ice time and power play production. And if he's not starting the season and they start OEL on that power play and it gets hot, then he could potentially lose that spot altogether. So there is a lot of risk to this file. In a midseason video I did last year on the Panthers, I noted that Montour essentially replaced the production that Ekblad was putting up in 21-22. So in 21-22, Ekblad was an 83.43, and then last year he dropped down to a 75.80. So I would expect a similar regression for Montour, which means he's still going to be a good defenseman in fantasy, but not the 6th best defenseman in fantasy or the 11th best most complete skater. So that's what we're looking at in terms of why he's on this list at number 1. There's a significant deviation. He's in this channel and then pops up 20 points or around 35% to where he is now between that and his 5-year average. He has some injury troubles at the end of last year. He may not start the season this year. He's got a lot less to work with in terms of guys who are also injured on his team. There's been a lot of turnover, and there's the Stanley Cup hangover that usually hits the losing team harder than the winning team. So for all of those reasons, I do see him as very risky. Now, again, it depends on where you get these guys. If you get him in the 8th, 9th round because of the injury, that's really good value for a guy who, did put up a ton of points last year and was excellent. 33 power play points, 242 shots, 92 hits, 73 points. In most years, he's going to lead the NHL in defensive scoring. Obviously, last year was not the case with Erik Karlsson hitting over 100 points, but an incredible season for Montour. But again, you're asking him to follow up a career season with another career season, and he's starting that season injured, and there's a lot of turnover from the Stanley Cup hangover and all the injuries. But that's going to do it for this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, leave a like, leave a comment. Think about subscribing if you're not already subscribed. I hope you're all getting excited for draft season. I'll be doing a lot more content like this. Up next, we're going to do this exact analysis, but for goaltenders. So stay tuned for that one. And as always, I will see you in the next one.